Ah, greetings, my wandering scholars. Whether you're curled up with a warm drink in a dimly lit room somewhere in Athens, or perhaps nestled under the stars on a hillside in the Peloponnese, or maybe even perched on a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean, I hope this hour finds you comfortable. Dim your lights if they are still bright. Let the hum of the world fade away and settle in for a little journey back in time. One that doesn't involve cobblestones, rutted tracks, or any of those modern conveniences we've come to take for granted. Tonight, we're stepping into the sandals of Greek nobles, not with the expectation of grand adventures, but with a quiet curiosity about how they actually got from one place to another when the concept of roads, as we know them, was still a few centuries away. No dramatic maps, no sweeping generalizations, just the lived experience, the practicalities, and the occasional moment where history has a sly sense of humor. If you're listening somewhere particularly charming or unusual, do say so in the comments below. I've been known to eavesdrop on such things, though I'll never admit it. And if this little excursion appeals to your historical curiosity, perhaps you'd consider supporting Sleepy Historian quietly, like a patron slipping a coin into an ancient treasury. No pressure, just a gentle nudge toward the idea that history is worth keeping alive. Now, let's begin. The Greeks, those clever, wine-loving, philosophy-debating folk of antiquity, did not, in fact, travel with roads in anything like the way we imagine today. When you picture ancient Greece, do you see a landscape crisscrossed with Roman-style stone highways? No, my friends, that's a future that hasn't happened yet. The roads of Rome were engineered with military precision, built to last centuries, and designed for legions marching in unison. But the Greeks, they had asterisk tracks asterisk. Yes, worn paths through hillsides, along coasts, across plains. But these were not the work of centralized governments or legions of engineers. They were instead the slow, organic result of centuries of feet stamping down earth, of herds grazing, of traders finding the most efficient way to move goods and people without the benefit of surveyors' chains or imperial decrees. So how did Greek nobles, those aristocrats with their fine tunics, their oil flasks, and their penchant for political one-upmanship, navigate this landscape? The answer, as always, is a delightful mix of necessity, opportunism, and sheer Greek ingenuity. It wasn't about grand construction. It was about local knowledge, seasonal timing, and the art of moving without being seen as too conspicuous or too slow. First, let's dispel a common misconception. The Greeks did lack asterisk roads. They had paths. The difference is one of scale and purpose. A Roman road like the Via Appia was built for thousands of soldiers to march in formation, with drainage, milestones, and rest stops. A Greek path, that might be little more than a depression in the earth where generations of shepherds, traders, or pilgrims had walked, watered by rain and worn deep by time. In some regions, particularly in the mountains or along coastlines, these paths were well trodden enough to be reliable, though not without their hazards. But for nobles, they weren't marching in formation. They were traveling with retinues, carrying goods, perhaps accompanied by slaves or clients, and they needed something smoother than a goat trail. Enter the asterisk dromos asterisk, a word that means path or road, but one that carried more weight than it suggests. The drama were the primary roots of ancient Greece, though not in the way we might expect. They weren't straight. They weren't built with engineering precision. They meandered along ridgelines, followed natural water sources, and often hugged the coast for easy navigation. Some were paved, not with stone like Roman roads, but with packed earth or gravel, smoothed by generations of use. Others were little more than traces, barely visible until you stood in them. Now, the nobles who used these paths didn't do so out of a love for hiking. They did it because trade was life, and politics required movement, whether it was a noble from Thebes journeying to Delphi to consult the oracle, or an Athenian aristocrat heading to Corinth for business or pleasure. But let's not romanticize this. Travel in ancient Greece wasn't glamorous. It was slow, arduous, and often uncomfortable. It required local knowledge, patience, and a willingness to adapt. A noble wouldn't have set out on a journey without first consulting locals, farmers, shepherds, or perhaps even slaves who knew the land intimately. Seasonality played a crucial role too. In winter, when storms could turn paths into rivers of mud, travel was limited to coastal routes where possible. Summer, meanwhile, brought its own challenges: heat, thirst, and the ever-present risk of bandits or marauding tribes, though let's be honest, most Greeks would have seen such threats as more myth than reality, unless you were unlucky enough to be a merchant in a disputed territory. The best time was spring or autumn, when the weather was mild and the land wasn't under water or baking hot. But what about the terrain? Greece is, after all, a land of mountains and valleys, not flat plains. So how did one navigate the steep ascents and descents? The answer lies in two key innovations, both practical and ingenious. First, there were the asterisk climax routes. A climax, from the Greek asterisk klimax, meaning ladder, was a series of switchbacks or zigzags cut into hillsides to allow for easier ascent. Some of these still exist today, though they've been worn down by time and weather. Imagine hiking up a mountainside in sandals, with perhaps a cloak draped over your shoulder, and you'll get a sense of the challenge. Though nobles would have had servants carrying supplies, so at least they weren't lugging their own oil. Second, there were the mules asterisk. Donkeys, or more often mules, the hybrid offspring of horses and donkeys, were the beasts of burden for Greek travelers. They could carry heavy loads over rough terrain, and while not the most graceful creatures, they were sturdy and enduring. A noble's retinue might include one or two mules, laden with goods, oil flasks, tools, perhaps a tent or two, and enough provisions to last several days. The muleteers, often slaves or hired hands, knew how to navigate the paths, how to find water, and how to push through when the going got tough. But let's not forget the sea. Greece is a peninsula dotted with islands, so coastal travel was just as important as overland journeys. Nobles who could afford it would take to ships or boats for longer distances, whether that meant sailing from Athens to Delos or from Corinth to Sicily. Ships were faster, more reliable when the weather cooperated, and less taxing on the body. And while we think of Greek sailors as daring adventurers, in reality, they were often locals who knew their waters intimately, fishermen by day, traders by night. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Greeks didn't have a single, unified network of roads or paths. Each polis, city-state, had its own routes, shaped by local geography and politics. So a path from Athens to Sparta wasn't the same as one from Thebes to Argos. It was unique, adapted to the landscape and the people who used it. This meant that travel could be unpredictable. A noble setting out from Athens might find himself taking a route that led him through olive groves in Megara, or along the coast past fishing villages, but there was no guarantee of a straight line. And what about infrastructure? Where did travelers rest? Unlike Rome, with its inns and way stations, Greece had no official system. Instead, nobles relied on hospitality, asterisk xenia asterisk, one of the cornerstones of Greek culture. This wasn't just a polite gesture, it was a sacred obligation. A stranger arriving in a town could expect to be offered food, shelter, and perhaps even entertainment. It was how alliances were forged, how trade thrived, and why Greeks could travel with relative safety. Though again, let's not overstate this. Xenia had its limits, especially if you were an enemy or a rival. But let's talk about the realities of travel for a Greek noble. It wasn't all sunlit olive groves and philosophical debates. There was mud, there was sweat. There were moments of frustration when a path petered out only to be replaced by a field of rocks, or when a storm turned a coastal route into a treacherous slog. And then there were the people, other travelers, traders, pilgrims, all moving in their own directions, sharing space without the modern conveniences of lanes or signposts. So how did nobles make it work? By being adaptable. They moved with the land, they followed the seasons, and they relied on local knowledge. They didn't have maps as we know them, but they had mental maps, an intimate understanding of the terrain built up over generations. A noble from Athens might know the path to Delphi by heart, having walked it himself or heard his father describe it in vivid detail. But let's not forget the role of politics in travel. In a world where alliances shifted like sands, taking the wrong path could mean walking into enemy territory, or worse, being caught between warring factions. So nobles traveled with caution, often accompanied by retainers who knew the local politics as well as the lay of the land. And what about speed? How long did it take to travel from one place to another? Well, that depends on your definition of speed. A noble walking from Athens to Corinth might cover 50 miles in a week if he was lucky. That's not bad for a man in sandals, but let's put it into perspective. Today, you could drive that distance in an hour. But in ancient Greece,